ABC used to be an English wax manufacturing company. I'm trying to see if I have any English wax here. Actually, this red print here on the chair is an English wax. Well, Clary or somebody can.
This one?
Yeah, that's the example of an English wax. And I showed the design a little bit earlier that looks like a batik. And the one under it is kind of a cheap imitation that I bought because that stuff is expensive and I couldn't afford to buy that much of it. And to give you an idea of the prices, actually, so the Dutch wax stuff, 6 yards of it, will run you anywhere between 40 to 100 euros.
Wow.
So that's a lot of money. And 6 yards is what you would buy to make a full outfit. So this is, a marker of who you are and what you have. So Vlisco ABC is now owned by Chinese manufacturers who have completely changed the market of wax prints. So the Chinese model is basically copy images exactly the images that other people make and sell them at a much lower rate. It's not the same quality because they don't use the same techniques, so they can have a much faster turnover. So, on one hand, they're copies, but on the other hand, they're expanding access to a lot of people, and it's creating massive problems for Vlisco, which has now changed its whole marketing technique, is doing a lot more market research in Africa where they had never done it before. So a lot of interesting things are happening. But you also have manufacturers in Africa. Uniwax is in Ivory Coast. I know it was coming. She's like, where are the Africans? It's coming. It's happening. There are African manufacturers. There's Uniwax in Ivory Coast. There's Ghana Textile Printing, GTP, yeah, Textile Printing in Ghana. There are manufacturers in Nigeria and Zambia. So you have manufacturers in other countries as well. But the quality is not the same because a lot of the quality has to do with the equipment you have, right? And the value, Vlisco has a value it has because it's color fast. Like I have pieces that my mother has owned for like 30 years and it looks like new, right? You wash it, nothing happens to it. It sits in the sun, nothing happens to it. The fabric is sturdy. Whereas these other things, like this is made in Tanzania. And the design is very pretty, the colors are nice, but the feel isn't right, and you wash it a few times and it's completely washed out, right? So that's part of the reason that the European brands have retained their prominence. So wax prints are not owned by just one person either, so authenticity doesn't quite lie in sort of ownership of the brand. So maybe if we look at the way that the cloth is used, maybe we can say, okay, well, certain dress is more authentic than others. Here, you have a range of things, from a market woman. So clearly she's not going to be wearing her Sunday's best at the market, but she's wearing wax prints. You have, kind of women out on the town. This is sort of what your everyday outfit would look like, or even like this looks like a Sunday church kind of scene where the whole family is in wax. And at weddings, for instance, you'll have people everybody will wear the same cloth in different, cut in individual styles, but out of the same cloth. And so the cloth is used, in everyday gear, special occasions, and so on, but it's also a key part of dowry. So traditionally, in West Africa, when a suitor's coming for, his wife, he's supposed to bring with him like a case of cloth. And the idea is that, and of course, the bigger the impression you want to make, the more cloth you give. And the idea is that you're giving a sense of how well you're going to treat your wife once you bring her home and you're starting her wardrobe for her. And this builds on traditions that existed before wax prints were introduced to Africa, because clearly wax prints weren't the first cloth that existed in Africa, right? Like I showed the tie-dye, but then there were also hand-woven textiles, and there's a whole other story about how wax prints kind of took over the market. So, it serves many functions, so both in dress and kind of symbolic functions, but also in politics. What you'll find when you go to West Africa is that often presidents or kind of prominent people, or the Pope, for instance, there'll be prints with their heads on there that people will buy to kind of show affiliation, and or that will be distributed to cronies. So this is cloth as propaganda, right? But it has been done for a long time. And of course, these are all like dictators, right? So you have Mobutu of Zaire, you have Houphouët-Boigny of Ivory Coast, Paul Biya of Cameroon. So it's a very common practice, but also one of the key ways that the cloth gets used. And I mentioned earlier how it's been sort of mobilized in the United States as part of sort of Black power and Black arts movements. The cloth is also being used now in high fashion. So Gucci, Burberry, these brands have started using wax cloth. And part of the way that Vlisco is dealing with the new challenges to its market is to reach out to fashion designers to buy their cloth and to make stuff out of. So it's being used by European designers, but it's also being used by African designers, right? And actually, the cloth that she's wearing was designed by one of the guys in one of the pictures before. And it's, this very popular design that, you still see today, and it was drawn probably like 40 years ago, at least. And so the way these prints work is that when they put out something, there's a lot of trial and error, because the designers have a lot of latitude in terms of what they draw. So until very recently, as I said, there was no market research. So they would draw something, if it looked right, they would consult with traders, but then also just throw a bunch of stuff onto the market. And when it took, the women on the ground would give it a name, right? So that design, for example, in the back is called Angelica in West Africa, or which one? I don't have any other ones. If my mom were here, she could tell you the names, but I don't know. Or that one with the flowers behind Carmel is called Wedding Flowers, for example. And that's how it takes. So you could have a woman wearing cloth that her mother and her grandmother wore. And this is the value also of these European brands, because they're the ones who were producing it before. But now, of course, you can buy the Chinese knockoff for a fraction of the price. So beyond fashion, now you see the cloth more and more also in accessories, household items everywhere. So this always brings up interesting feelings. I know. It's like $2,000 at Anthropologie. FYI, it's about $2,000.
Where at?
Anthropology. You've seen that store? Yeah.
We can do a copy.
I know, right? Exactly. We'll get the Chinese version. But you see the bag for Vlisco is also, as part of its new strategy, is bringing out accessories, very high-end accessories, so $300 handbags and so on. But then I bought shoes with imitation wax prints. You see, this is a version of the wedding flowers print right there. But you buy them at Aldo's, right? These things are becoming more and more common.
Really?
Yeah, definitely. You find it at Aldo's now.
Did you get yours at Aldo's?
I did get mine at Aldo's. I was in California. I was like, I can't not buy these things. You know what I mean? Like, it's just too good. And one thing I wanted to mention actually about the trade, about how these designs came about, in addition to everything I mentioned, Indonesian designs, objects, and so on, was also that there was a certain amount coming from West Africa itself. In Togo, particularly, Togo used to be the heart of trade in the region. He had these women traders, wholesale traders, and they were known as Nana Benz, and Benz because they were so rich that they only drove Mercedes-Benzes, right? So these women, most of them hadn't gone to school, but they were extremely savvy businesswomen and trained their daughters into it and became multimillionaires. So they had relationships with the European producers, exclusive rights to the cloth, and then were responsible for distributing it throughout West and Central Africa. So they made a ton of money off of it, right? And so they could ask designers to create a particular design that only they would have the right to sell. But now, again, with the Chinese coming into the market, anybody can sell pretty much anything. So this is having a devastating impact on these traders as well, who no longer get the kind of business that they used to get, right? So, I've gone through this whole thing, and, I imagine that by now you get my point. My point is that it's hard to pinpoint authenticity in any one aspect of the cloth, right? We've looked at where it comes from, we've looked at the images on it, we've looked at who's drawing it, what's made of it, and all of it is always about a mix of things, right, of sources. And so, the question comes up, so what? And I like the juxtaposition of these two images because, it happened by chance, but I think it's kind of perfect. On one hand, you have this headless black woman wearing this cloth, which to me kind of symbolizes, you have an entire continent clothed in this thing. But then the designs are attributed to a single designer. And so the question of who owns these designs is an open one because, so literally, this is something that I'm sure everybody has seen, right? The dashikis, everybody has seen, owned something in this print before. And this is the man who drew it, right? But you see, it's something that has very strong Indonesian influences, very strong African kind of patterns, and his own imagination. And who's to say that it's his or it's not his? the credit can be distributed as narrowly, as broadly as you want. But to me, the issue that comes up is, the reason people, especially people of African descent or from the continent, look to this cloth for cultural identification, right? So now what happens when the object that you're grounding this thing in, you can no longer speak of as authentic, right? To me, that's kind of the crux of the issue. And I guess my point is that even though wax isn't authentically anything, it doesn't for as much mean that the identity that is based on it is not real, right? So as a West African woman, I have no issue, well, I have no issue, not saying too much, but at this point, I am still okay with kind of claiming wax print as part of my cultural heritage because I see it and it does something to me. It moves me and it connects to memories. It's mine. And I don't think that can be taken away from me as much as I can intellectually make a point about how it's this hybrid object that belongs to everybody, belongs to nobody, right? And so part of what I'm trying to do with my research is to try to tell that story because it'd be easy. I'm in a history, anthropology, and science and technology studies program. And I could do this project and tell this exact story of how it's complicated, that it might be interesting. But then in the end, I couldn't stand in front of a room of West African people and say, therefore, this isn't West African. It doesn't make sense. And so part of or to me, at least, it doesn't make sense. So what I want to do is to be able to look at how wax print moves from conception, right, from an idea in somebody's head, and how does that idea come about, right? Is it about a certain image of what Africa is, what Africans like, or what Africans should like, and so on? How does it move from conception all the way to distribution to use and reuse? And the argument that I'm trying to make is that it's over the trajectory of wax print from idea to object that's being used and reused that it becomes something. And it becomes many things along the way, but one of the things it becomes is a West African cultural object, regardless of where it's coming from, right? So that's the story I'm hoping to tell. So my research involves kind of spending time along this track in Holland, and because I'm focusing on European-produced wax. So, to wrap up, I'd say that, objects like wax cloth hold a huge, tremendous value in the crafting of cultural identity, even if they can be said to be authentically African. And as much as I'm okay with saying, this is mine, somebody could look at this and be like, okay, so African people wear this and a European firm is making money. We've seen this story before somewhere, right? This isn't exactly new, right? I don't know. So, somebody could take that sense to it and be like, you know what, I don't want to have anything to do with this. And I think that would be completely legitimate as well, right? And I think for me, the key is that I think, back to what Najma said about critical memory, I think it's also about critically looking at things, right? When we have these objects that we impute with some sort of self-identifying function, if these objects that we see as reflective of who we are in a way, I think we have a responsibility to ourselves to really ask ourselves, how did this object come to be? How was it brought into our awareness, right? Because, of course, some histories are more transparent than others, but everything comes from somewhere. So it's really a question of how hard is it going to be to find out where the stuff actually comes from. Because once we know where it comes from, then we're at liberty to choose how we approach it. We're at liberty to decide, this is how I'm going to make use of this cloth. This is what it's going to mean to me. And, you can choose to accept it as yours, or you can say, okay, now that I know what's going on here, I can think creatively about what I can do to deal with the dissonance of it, right? With the fact that, hey, this is mine, but it's not quite mine. What can I do about it? But you can't do that without knowing the complexity that underlies it. So all that to say that authenticity needn't define, the cultural identity that is grounded in an object. That's it.